Skyrim and The Witcher 3 are two giant games and are thought by many as arguably the two greatest open world RPGs of all time. But which is better? I've put countless hours into both of these colossal games over the years, so in today's video I'm going to decide which reigns supreme over the other and give my opinions on which game is better and why. I won't be talking about any of the mods or DLCs for either game, but that's something I could potentially do in the future. I'm a huge fan of these games, so it's going to be difficult to actually decide which is better, so make sure you stick around to the end because it's going to be a great video. Make sure you leave a comment because I'd love to hear what you have to say and I want to hear which game you think is better. And if you like this video, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any future content. Skyrim's open world measures at roughly 15 squared miles, and in this rich and vast area there's over 300 discoverable locations. This could be anything from a small city that's full of life to an ancient dragon burial mound. There's an unlimited amount of dragons to hunt down and slay, and they never get boring. There's also 186 dungeons to discover and explore, which is a lot. You can find anything in these such as weapons, shouts, ores, or even stones of Baron Zaya to name a few. They're a lot of fun to explore because you never know what you'll find inside, and each dungeon feels different. Not only does Skyrim have an impressive amount of dungeons to explore, it's impressive that I never got bored of exploring them. You'd think it would be repetitive, but not once did I get bored of coming across a new one. There's so many dotted around the map, it's very likely most people will finish the game without actually finding them all. One of my favourite things about Skyrim is the side quests. Want to become a wizard? Join the College of Winterhold. Want to become an assassin? Join the Dark Brotherhood. There's so many options and quests that you can do that will shape your character into the Dragonborn you want them to be. The side quests are all amazing and have completely unique and interesting stories behind them, and it makes exploring very fun. Most of your travelling will be done on foot, which I think makes the map seem larger than it is, and even if you use a horse they move fairly slow. You can fast travel if you wanted, but you'd be missing out on the exploration, which is a huge part of Skyrim. The sky and stars are probably the most impressive thing visually about this game. Looking up into the colourful night sky and seeing massive planets looks absolutely epic. The Witcher 3's map in comparison measures at roughly 52 squared miles, which is absolutely massive. I could spend hours riding Roach exploring the vast world and just taking it all in. Visually, the map looks and feels great. The world is split into 6 regions, but your time is mainly spent in Velen, Novigrad and Skellige. In my opinion, Skellige is the most impressive region out of them all. The colours and the mountains are outstanding, and every location is fun to explore. However, travelling on water isn't as fun, as the boats move at a snail's pace, but every region is filled with enjoyable content. You can find monster contracts, monster nests, guarded treasure, loot caches, Gwent cards, horse races, fist fights amongst a ton of side quests. The best thing about The Witcher 3 is venturing away from the main story and discovering new characters and quests. Everything is very detailed and has an actual story behind it, which made exploring very rewarding. The huge cities like Novigrad are also very fun to be in because they're full of life and the world genuinely feels lived in and is filled with people going about their day-to-day life. Both games are a lot of fun to explore and very rewarding when you do venture off the beaten track and start discovering new things. The Witcher 3 has a lot of enjoyable content to find, and you can easily spend over 200 hours in one playthrough. It looks great and has Gwent, which is probably the most addicting thing I've ever come across. But I think that Skyrim's world is more fun to explore. Even though the map is smaller and isn't as impressive visually, the world feels as though it has more content. I found the side quests more interesting because I enjoyed the storylines they come with. I loved the idea I could become a member of the Dark Brotherhood, or I could join the Companions and become a werewolf. I felt that I had way more choices about who I wanted my character to become. Both games are very interesting and have enjoyable worlds to explore, but I would have to give the edge to Skyrim. Combat for both games is incredible. The Witcher 3 has more tactical combat and you can block, dodge and counter strikes. You can use swords, maces and axes, but I always stuck to using the 2 swords. You also have a number of magic signs, potions and bombs to use which affect enemies in different ways. I'll talk more about that later on in the video. You can also use a crossbow which comes in useful against enemies that can fly, and it can be equipped with different bolts. The fighting feels very fluent in The Witcher 3, especially on horseback. Time slows down when you're approaching an enemy when you're on horseback, which improves accuracy when striking, which is very helpful when you're galloping at high speeds. Fighting against hordes of enemies is very satisfying because the controls are so simple and effective, and slow motion executions looked brutal. Skyrim's combat is a bit more simple depending on how you choose to play. Using a sword and shield, for example, is simply just a block and strike system, but when you begin to start using things like spells and magic staffs, the combat is more advanced. There's so many weapons to pick from, ranging from one-handed swords to two-handed battle axes. You can use crossbows, a huge number of spells, as well as different shouts. My favourite shout was Unrelenting Force, as I felt so powerful making an enemy fly off a ledge. Just like The Witcher, Skyrim also has a huge amount of potions you can either use on yourself or apply to your weapons to give you an edge during combat. And the game allows you to upgrade and enhance your weapons as well, which allowed you to create very powerful items. The Witcher 3 allowed you to add ruins to your swords, whereas Skyrim allowed you to enchant your weapons with cool effects. This made combat more interesting, but I feel enchanting items in Skyrim was much more important than using ruins in The Witcher, as the effects were much more noticeable. This is a really tough decision to decide which has better combat. Skyrim has such a huge range of ways to play the game that affect how the combat feels, but basing it solely just on the combat in general, I'm going to have to say The Witcher has better combat, purely because it felt so smooth. If you decide to play through Skyrim with a sword and shield or a two-handed weapon, the combat doesn't feel as smooth, as it's basically just blocking and striking. It's only when you start adding in magic items the combat begins to feel more tactical. So for that reason, I think The Witcher 3 has better combat.
They're sure to have caught my scent.
The Wild Hunt, pursuing you.
I'll endanger all.
The Witcher 3 is a story that I felt connected with because decisions I made throughout the game would actually have an impact on how the story played out. Because there's so many potential endings to the story, it made the decisions I made feel more important. I could see how much Geralt, the Emperor, and other characters cared about Ciri. The Witcher 3 managed to do an excellent job at making me care about the characters, and it had a story that could pull on your heartstrings. There's so many interesting characters to meet in the world with their own stories and personalities, which made each character feel different. There's also an incredible amount of voice actors, and they all sounded great. However, anyone who's played Skyrim will know their range of voice actors is terrible, but it's easy to overlook and ignore because the story is so good. The main questline is the story of a Dragonborn whose destiny is to defeat Alduin the World Eater, whose profit is to destroy the world. It doesn't take that long to complete the main story, and it's much shorter than The Witcher's. The Witcher forces you to explore the world and take part in side activities so you can level up your character for the next main quest, but with Skyrim that's not as necessary, so the main story feels much shorter than The Witcher's. Although this isn't a bad thing, I think both stories are a good length, and they're both so interesting it leaves you wanting more at the end. Both games have unique characters you can meet, from Greybeards who live in seclusion at the top of a mountain 7,000 steps high, to Ulfric Stormcloak, the Jarl of Windhelm and the leader of a rebellion. Then The Witcher 3 has you meeting characters like Dijkstra, who's head of the Redanian intelligence and plots to kill the king, to a poet and singer, Dandelion, who's close friends with Geralt. Both games have so many opportunities to find and meet new characters, and you'll never get bored of finding someone new, because they're interesting to talk to, and more than likely they'll have a quest for you. I think both games have a great main storyline, and both have a lot of unique people to meet. But taking everything into account, I'm going to have to say The Witcher does a better job, purely because of the range of voice actors compared to Skyrim. The Witcher 3 has a huge amount of enemies to fight. If you actually go and read the bestiary, you'll realise how many this game has. Not only does The Witcher 3 have a huge range of dangerous monsters, they all have their own weaknesses that can be used against them. For example, a wraith would slow down and be easier to hit if you was to use Yarden. Bombs, potions and oils that you can use against monsters affected each one in a different way, which made every encounter with a beast feel exciting and unique. Enemies come in all shapes and sizes as well. One minute you could be fighting a human, and the next you'll be attacked by a giant griffin. The vast open world is completely filled with a ton of savage monsters. Skyrim also has a wide range of enemies to fight and kill, ranging from mud crabs to legendary dragons. Most of the encounters were against Draga when you're exploring dungeons, and there's a lot of annoying wolves roaming around outside as well, but there's enough enemies to fight that kept it interesting, just not as many as The Witcher. Some enemies had their own abilities which made them more interesting, such as spiders spat venom, humans could use spells, and trolls would regain health. So the enemies were always interesting to fight because you didn't know what they was going to throw at you. Fights against the massive dragons were always fun because they were so strong. I've had fights against dragons for longer than 10 minutes before when I've been playing on the harder difficulties because they have so much health, and they looked and sounded incredible. The greatest enemy without a doubt for The Witcher 3 is the Wild Hunt. They looked absolutely incredible. The design of the armour for the Wild Hunt is outstanding, and the voice acting for Eridan was brilliant, which made for some epic boss fights against the Wild Hunt. Skyrim on the other hand has countless bosses that a lot of people won't even find. Going back to what I mentioned earlier in the video, the map is so full of content and the world is so fun to explore, but if you want to find these bosses, you have to actually explore and look for them. Alduin is a great main story boss and he looks incredible, but there's a lot more out there that you can find in Skyrim if you explore, and they all look brilliant and have great stories behind them. Again, this is really difficult to decide which game has the better enemies. On one hand, The Witcher 3 has more enemy types and they all have weaknesses which make them all feel unique. But Skyrim on the other hand has so many dragons and secret bosses which all look insane. I'm edging towards Skyrim and I have to pick one for this video, so I'm going to say Skyrim has the better and more interesting enemies. I keep coming back to these two games over and over, but why? The simple answer is because they're amazing. But Skyrim has so much replay value because there's so many ways you can develop your character and play through the game. I've played through Skyrim using an archer around 10 times alone. You can play as a warrior, a mage, an assassin, and a thief to name a few. Or you could become a jack of all trades and learn everything. There's also 10 different races you can play as, and each come with their own perks, so there's already 10 reasons to start up a fresh game. Different armour sets suit different character builds as well, so it's worth playing through several times so you can craft and use new armour. As well as this, the story is great, so it's always fun to come back and play. Even if you aren't going to spend countless hours doing all the side quests, it's still entertaining to come back to Skyrim and relive the Dragonborn story. And the reason I keep coming back to The Witcher 3 is because the story is so strong and can change depending on your decisions. The world is also a lot of fun to explore and looks fantastic, so I always find myself coming back to explore and look for content I may have missed. Another reason is that I'm a huge Gwent addict. Collecting the cards and playing against random people in the taverns is very entertaining. I've also loved the idea of being able to replay the game and be part of a different Witcher school. I think this would add more replay value to the game if each school had different perks that would affect the character, or even had new styles we could use. But I think Skyrim offers such a diverse range of ways you can play, it has much more replay value than The Witcher. Both games have immense stories and brilliantly detailed worlds to explore that will always be fun to come back to. But Skyrim has more ways to play through the game and develop your character, and because of that, I'm saying Skyrim has much more replay value. Skyrim and The Witcher 3 are both incredible games, and they're probably my two favourite games of all time, and I know they're definitely my two most played games. This video could have been so much longer and we could have took even more into account and talked about things like the skill trees, soundtrack, the DLCs and the mods. But I chose to base the video on story and characters, replayability, enemy types, the combat, and the world and the content you can find. So I think Skyrim has more replay value because there's so many unique ways you can build your character, and I think the content you can find when you explore is more exciting. And I also think Skyrim has better enemies because the dragons are insane, but also because there's so many cool bosses that you can find when you start exploring. However, I think The Witcher overall has a better story because of the characters, and there's such a range of people to meet and they don't all sound the same like they can in Skyrim, and I also feel the combat is better because it feels a lot smoother. So from what I've judged these two iconic games on, I'll have to say Skyrim is better, but both are immense, and if you haven't played either of them, I highly recommend you go and buy them. Make sure you let me know in the comments what you think about these two games. If you disagree with what I've said, that's fine, this is just my opinion, but let me know in the comments what you think. And if you like this video, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any future content.